The web service we're going to use here is going to be one of Riot Games' web services. It's going to be its Summoner web service to get detail about an account. You see I have an account here. My account's name is I have cute dogs. Riot's web service allows me to get more detail about that account by pulling that Summoner name and executing the request against their web service. And I get detail like my account ID, my name, my profile icon, what my level is, and kind of things like that. So because we're using a Summoner web service, let's go ahead and create a services file for Summoner called Summoner.js. Now, in order to make a request outside of our project here, we need to probably install another package. I prefer to use a package called Axios. It's fairly common. But before we start working with Axios, we need to define that URL endpoint that we're going to be calling. So let's go over here and let's pull this URL that we had right here from Riot. And let's create a config file that contains that URL. Now, config is different than environment variables because config is going to be committed to Git. So we don't want to include any sensitive data like our API key here. This URL right here is anyone.api.writing blah, 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 then my summoner name. There are two things here that can change. This NA1 is the region. So let's just say region. And this I have cute dogs is actually the summoner name. So let's create a function that gives us the URL. And ta-da, that's it. And now if we were to call this function with region and summoner name as parameters, it would return back a string because it's a one-liner. It will return whatever's on this one line. It will return back the string with the region and the summoner name inserted in those places. Let's go ahead and export that summoner by name. Apparently I misspelled summoner up here. That's fine. And now let's go to our summoner file. Let's say const config equals require. We got to go up one because we're one layer higher in our hierarchy. And we're also going to require Axios because we've installed that already. Let's go over to our index.js and let's create our summoner request. And we're going to route this to a location. Let's say it's summoner.details or account details or something like that. And we're going to have to import summoner equals require services slash summoner. So we don't have account details defined yet, but we'll do that right now. Let's create const account details equals request response and then a body. And then we also need to module.exports equals account details. We're going to return a response.status of 200.json, and we'll just return account details, or we'll just say data. We'll just call it data. We can define a data variable right here equals test. And we go to slash summoner. We should see test. Now this obviously is just returning data that's local to the code. So let's go ahead and use Axios to request data from Riot Games. With Axios, there's multiple ways to make the request. I like to use Axios's .get, .post functions to actually post and get from URLs. But things like headers, I prefer to use something called Axios options, or options that would be an extra parameter in your Axios request. So I'm going to set up, because Riot Games uses headers for its token, let's go ahead and look at that real quick so you can understand what I'm talking about. In its request, in order for us to authenticate, we have to include our Riot token, which is right here for me, in a header. So the header is an X-Riot token. Let's create this Axios option. We're going to include a headers object, and then we're going to say the X-Riot token needs to equal. And let's put that in our environment variables, Riot key. And then our environment file will say Riot key equals, and I'll go copy this from here. And I'm not too worried about this key being available to everyone because it will expire within 24 hours before this video is published, so not too concerning. The important thing to note is if we were to run this file on its own, this process.environment.riot key would be undefined because we are not running .env.config. But if we run the whole project using node index.js, .env.config would set that process environment variable. So something important to note is if you're debugging individual files by doing something like node and then services / summoner, this process environment riot key would be undefined. Let's make our first request. Something first to note is that Axios is an asynchronous request. It's probably a good idea to define our whole function as asynchronous, just because otherwise it wouldn't make sense to try to put asynchronous requests in a synchronous function. And let's just define it as a response is, well, not a response. Let's define it as constant Riot response equals awaits Axios.get config.summonername by URL. We're going to include the requests region and the requests.summonername. We're also going to include the Axios options. So now if we run node index.js and we go here and we actually call this summoner with region equals na1 ampersand summoner name equals I have cute dogs, I'm going to get an error because I didn't notice something. Undefined dot, oh, it's request dot query. What am I doing? Let me try that again. There we go. We actually get data back from Riot. And I'm going to show you something else. It's an app called Postman. It's going to give you a little bit prettier a format to return back. So if instead I do something like this, my format comes back in a prettier JSON format. So if you want to work with something a little bit easier when you're working with APIs, I recommend downloading and using Postman. It also allows you to post data to an API as well as all these other different API types. So valuable. I personally really like it, but for right now, testing get APIs in a browser, that should work just fine too. And that's it. We now have a functional get data from Riot by username and region. Now I'm actually going to clean this up a little bit by saying something called get summoner by name equals asynchronous region summoner name. I don't think it's a good idea to have these requests out to a third-party API within this actual route. I think it's a good idea to call it out to a separate asynchronous function. Reason for that is if I wanted to call this in other places, I would have to rewrite it every time I had a request and response. Maybe I don't even want to call this from when I'm making a request and response. Maybe I want to call this from an automated process. This allows me to do that by not tying it to that request. Instead, I can build it out as something completely separate. So pretty close to this. I can do something like constant response now because the response isn't already defined. And I can do await Axios, same exact thing. But now I just need region and summoner name. And then return response.data. And rather than over here, all this jazz, I can just await data equals await get summoner by name. And then request.query.region request.query.summoner name. And we also need to pass data as the return object. Now, there's some additional stuff I'm going to work with is I'm actually going to turn this into a parser per se or a middleware app in the next video, but we're not going to worry about it too much right now. I'm just going to rename this to Summoner Parser and then also rename it here. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. And I'm also going to do one more thing here. I'm going to make sure that we're not going to try to make that request when we don't have both a summoner name and a region. So we're going to check here to see if there is not a summoner name and or if there's not a query.region. So what this is saying is if there's not a summoner name or there's not a region, then just immediately return response.status of 403.json error missing summoner name or region. So if we try that again, this should still work. But if I don't include summoner name, it should tell me missing summoner name or region. I could obviously make that a little bit more detailed by actually individually calling out missing summoner name or missing region. I think just putting it all in one if statement is fine too.